the other entrance will be off 52 South, just below the Lutheran Home.
That's crazy. I thought it was right there.
What are we getting, a road?
Johnny Ball's property.
Well, it was Henry, we bought it. Henry Farm.
Henry Farmer bought it. He used to share crop.
I know, it-
The family share crop.
he told me, Henry and I got to be big buds, because we were both chemists. He bought a whole lot of jewelry. But he told me one time that they were there and the landowner came in and told them to get off and said they had to walk, and they walked to New London. And got someplace to stay there, but they had no place to live. And I think that's why he bought all that.
Is there a point where you could say that?
We'll get it back.
Get that.
Well, I mean, like maybe, are you doing?
Henry was
Maybe.
tormented by that sort of thing.
That works. But not, I'll see.
And it's a
If there's
shame.
kids, I'll see that and swing my cane.
It's a shame, because he was so smart and so,
After it,
such a good guy.
that's usually.
Joey?
Oh, thank you.
Some of the questions. To be moved.
I don't
know what else you could.
He'd be a good football player. He said he.
Okay.
Back then, the guys had to provide their own jocks.
I'm gonna
He couldn't afford
give us a
that.
calendar
Bear
on it. That's
got
okay,
that.
Charles. I won't take
Yeah,
too long.
it was, and then he was working hard to fight. And he told me about one day
Gotta
at
get
lunch,
our
he decided to
schedule
go
ready
over to
next
see
month.
if there's any chance he might go to school there. He went over, he told me the lady that he talked with and how she made it possible for him to go to school.
Back to regular classes.
He went 1 year to state. Playing football.
After
And then,
September.
I
That's when
don't
we
know,
were
he
gonna
just
do.
goes back to him, just didn't let it stay there.
September.
But after working as a carpenter
Yeah.
a little while, he decided he wanted to go back to school.
We'll go back to regular classes.
I tell you
Yeah,
what.
well, we're
these-
gonna do a
the
survey,
ladies-
yeah, and see what, how people wanna do it, was the plan.
Okay.
Because I feel like if we divide now, we're gonna have such low numbers in both groups, and we're not gonna have enough teachers.
Okay. That's what.
Because I don't have, if we go back to the other classes, for example, it's gonna be Joseph in that class. And I'm trying to
Well, I
contact some
understand.
people and get them to teach. So next Sunday, and there are a few people who have expressed to me, they would like to come, but they want it to be more spread out for a little bit longer. So
Are you kidding?
in order to.
Well, they can be spread out.
No.
As chairperson of the education committee, I have tried to do what I feel like would be the most equitable for everyone.
Just say equal. I don't like the word equal. Say equal.
Well, how's that?
He also didn't like when you finished.
Okay, anyway, so we're gonna be meeting in the fellowship hall, and we're gonna have the microphone because it can be kind of hard to hear in there. And next Sunday, Noah's gonna teach, because as you know, Noah is our intern, and he is very interested in going into adult education. So we feel like that's
That's great.
that's an opportunity for him. We need to give him as many opportunities as we can to, practice his skills. So that'll be Noah. And then, I don't know, Chris, it would be, if we continue the rotation, it would be you, August the 1st and August the 8th. Are you amenable to that?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Think so.
Now, I may get Rufus or somebody who's part of our teaching rotation.
Okay.
Good use.
Absolutely. Well, Rufus, if you want to do one,
Let
I'd
me
love to put
let me
you
look
on.
and see.
He and I'll work it out.
Okay, I'll put Chris _Rufus. That'd be great. I didn't know you were in the rotation.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing we're gonna do, is we're gonna have a survey so people can say, if they're willing to teach, do they want to continue with this curriculum? Is there a particular curriculum they like, so that we can try to find what is, what will
I don't
be
think
best.
we would want to lose our identity, our class,
Right,
our traditional good news class.
right.
So how many,
We've
by
been
having it
strong.
spaced, how many are we gonna pick up? by doing that?
No.
I mean, did you just have one person? Did you
No,
have
I've
two?
had several,
Okay,
yes. Often. Everywhere I go.
and they're not
We'll
going to
see,
the,
we'll see. It's
they're
worth a
not going to the
try.
grocery
It's
store.
worth a try. We'll see if that's really what.
And then would you be amenable to teaching on the 15th? No, would it be Joseph next?
It's Joseph next.
Okay, that'd be the 15th, Joseph.
That's worth it.
She moves, okay. And then you,
That's right.
and if I have someone else who wants to teach, I'll let you know. I had contacted Britt Newsome and they were on vacation this week and haven't heard back from them. So I'll send an email with this. Okay, thanks. Sorry to take some
I'm
time.
glad, this is excellent because that was the thing we were going to try to bring up. This lesson kind of relates to issues. And I was going to bring it up at that time, so I'm glad you're all on top of it and addressing it.
Well, I'm trying.
And took care of the issue or
Thank
took
you.
care of the questions right at first.
Thank you.
We have had a lot of people ask when we're getting back to our. side.
Right. I have had a
I
lot
have
of those
had a
questions.
bunch do that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
also, the survey, how is that?
I'm gonna have a paper copy and then maybe I can get Noah to do it online because he's really good at technology.
Okay.
But I'm gonna have a paper copy available for Sunday school, starting next week.
Okay, but now what about people who don't come to Sunday?
I'll have it available online or maybe we'll put it in the newsletter,
Yeah, these are-
newsletter. Yeah,
Probably more people would see that.
okay, I'll do the
I
newsletter.
don't know.
I just got a little behind because of Bible school.
Yeah, you did a good job.
So,
Yeah, that was good.
yeah, it was really good. We had a good turnout. We had 19 kids was our busiest night.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sure. Our president would like us not here again today. So are there any
They're
concerns?
still, I think.
They're still in Knox.
I didn't see his name on the front page of the paper, so I think he's still president.
He's still president. And I have no interest in usurping his being president. And
Well, everybody knows he's leaving.
May not be permanent though, right?
we hope, maybe.
Well, if he sells his house.
He sells his house and it's up for sale.
Has he done his house?
Yeah.
Oh, I was hoping that would go for maybe a year or two and come back.
Are there any concerns that you brought the class over the one we just done?
I would like to voice a concern. I think most all of you know Peggy Burris. If you've been to community concerts, she's usually on the ticket sales with me. She's 91 years old, very active. She was just in the paper not more than a month ago. She works in her flowers in her yard 2 or 3 hours a day. And she has bronchitis. She was at my house Monday and we played bridge club. And Wednesday, Tuesday she went to her ophthalmologist in Charlotte. And then Wednesday she woke up sick. And she is now in the hospitals with COVID. They say it is a variant. She's had the shots, but they say it is a variant. And her great grandson has it. And she had ridden with him on Friday. So keep her in your prayers and her family.
How is she?
You know, she's on a ventilator.
No, she is not on a ventilator,
That's good.
but she is struggling. But doctors have told her children that she will have to go to a facility for rehabilitation,
Thank you for.
which is very hard for her because she's very determined. She's a retired teacher.
90 years of age becomes a tough time for lots
Yeah,
of folks.
like I say, she's 91. She and I have the same birthday. She was 91 when I was 81.
And sometimes vaccines don't take as well for those that are of a certain age as they do for some that are younger.
I think she had the Pfizer.
Well, that still should be taking care of most of them, for most.
It might be what's keeping up the ventilator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope so.
It could be well be. Okay, the lesson today is from the Acts. And for the Sundays in the lesson that was saying, the purpose statement is to discern how the church can best care for its members in need. However, what I could tell from this corollary of this, would be to discern how the church can best care to survive and to grow. So that was also involved in the issues being expressed. The author is unknown, but it is thought to be Luke because of his good interactions with Paul later on and Luke's position. So Luke has his own gospel, but this is he's also considered at least to be one of the authors, if not the author for the Acts as well. Now, one thing I was kind of glossed over, or maybe I've glossed over the years, is how fast things happened after Christ was here. This religion just took off. Christ's term was 30 years to the AD, but by AD 60, it had spread all the way to Rome. And some of the reasons with this would be was because the Romans themselves and their wonderful roads that they had become developed enough so people could move around. And so it'd be like, to them, what Rome did for them would be kind of like what Eisenhower developed and others after the interstate in the US. So just people started traveling in a wider way. So you could say that this was all God's sending, God's sent and God's plan, but also the Romans had an enormous role in making this happen.
The crossword puzzle for road in Rome is ITER. In case anybody's interested.
It's amazing to realize how really relatively new the interstate system is.
But that was the Roman ways, getting all around that region that they had developed, made the transfer of ideas, philosophies, concepts just spread. Jesus came along at just the right time to make all this happen. So that's the part that God may be involved in it, or is involved in it. And the topic is the choosing of the seven. And the passage comes from Acts 6, verses 1 through 7. And I have a frog in my throat, so I'm gonna have to do this again. But I'll do it. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Grecian Jews among them complained about the Hebraic Jews because the widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word." This proposal pleased the whole group. They chose Stephen, a man of faith and the Holy Spirit, also Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas from Antioch, who was a convert to Judaism. They presented these men to the apostles, who prayed and laid their hands on them. So the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jesus in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Now, the author in the teacher's edition or the student's edition had their own idea of what this was about. However, I have my own kind of trite
I
notions.
do too when you get through.
Okay. Now, suppose you had an agency in Stanley County that came to Stanley County distribution of food, taking care of the population. And Albemarle, and the ones in charge were the Albemarlites. Albemarlites. But you had all those Locustinites and Oakboroughites, and they had a bunch of widows over there. Now, they didn't quite speak all the language, same kind of language people Albemarle spoke. They were kind of a little different kind of group. But they have become part of the Christian movement at the time. And the widows also that became part of this group did not have access to the Jewish access as far as taking care of them. So now they were relying on the Christians. And part of the Christians were just hoarding it all. So they began to complain, but they got together and decided that they would find a way to correct this. And they decided to get people representing Oakmorites and the Oakmorites and the Locustites, and they got them together and they worked their issue out. The other point is what caused the widows. And I had to think about this a bit, and realizing that Jesus was an old man practically by the time he was crucified, and he probably did not have at that time a lot of years left. And people died, and the men got in squabbles and they fought. They died more quickly than the women, so they left a lot of widows. However, those that became widowers who lost their wives could also more easily marry, so widows accumulated. Now, it's not necessarily these widows were just in really awful shape. Some were. It's just like today, some are in great shape, some are in really a horrible shape. But that's another thing to possibly consider. But sometimes we have to use our creative imaginations to envision what the church of the first century looked like. We have good ideas that a church included rich and poor, Jews and Gentiles, men and women, and people who live within and outside of Judea. We do know, though, that the early church definitely consisted of widows. Widows show up as part of the early church throughout the book of Acts and also through Jesus' term. And in many other biblical accounts, we may have misconceptions about widows in the first century. There's a tendency to imagine that they were all destitute and fully dependent on the kindness of strangers who survived. That was certainly true for some widows and may have been the case for the widows here in Acts 6, since they seem to have been primary recipients of food service. It's also because there were so many of them, apparently. Widows could, however, control a significant amount of resources and seem to have been an integral part in funding much of the early Christian mission, including much of Jesus' ministry. Widows were the recipients of Jesus' compassion and healing on a number of occasions, such as the time he restored life to the only son of a widow in the town of Nain. And there were other situations with Jesus as well. Unlike women in the culture who were married, widows were outside the bounds of being defined primarily by their relationship to a man and were typically more economically vulnerable than the women who had husbands who were still primarily cared for by their fathers. But because of inheritance, as they indicated, they could also have a large amount of money that they could help out. Both Jesus and later on Paul, this situation we're talking about today occurred before Saul's conversion, and so before the time of Paul. And so we have not gotten to the conflicts of the Gentiles. We're just at this point in early stages called the growing pains among the Jews themselves were having a squabble.
Charles, I have a question.
Mhm.
If there were widows and they had children, why did their children not have some responsibility?
They did in some cases, or many cases. But sometimes as last week, as a Ruth and Naomi situation where they had no children and it had to be men children that were supporting them too. So, so women children, women are just useless.
I didn't hear that.
Boy, you're in trouble now.
And you weren't supposed to hear this. I'm just joking. But that was the, yeah, absolutely. And that's the point there. But that is the point that doesn't often enough get pointed out. The other point of this is this book with the books of the Bible and New Testament is a patriarchal society. These things are written by men. And I read through reading up on this very interesting article from a lady professor from Candler, which is Emory University. And she was talking about how important the women were and how many of them were widows. But what she had to go to were the apocryphal parts of the Bible, not regular books of the Bible. It's those things that are not included that she was referring to in many cases. And there it points out an enormous activity by women in the early church. So the women were extremely important, and maybe they were actually more numerous because they were widows and they were active in the church than the men themselves. So, but they were only in rare situations where they even mentioned. So we have to know that women were extremely important in the church at that time, despite the fact they were not considered. But there was a short, the other thing that comes into mind is that there's a short window there in which women were included more. And I fear that 300 to 400 years later, it became worse for women than it was even then. There was just a little window where women had an activity. Later on, and I started trying to think how this might be. The influence and strengthening of the Roman Catholic Church became even more patriarchal, I think. So women got less included. The other one was for market share. This is also the time Islam came into being. And in that same region, so they had their own aspects towards women, which was also extremely patriarchal. And so so the Islam, Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Roman Catholic Church had a role in changing this from within 2 to 3 centuries after. So there was a time there that women became even less of an influence in the church than they were in this early church. But this first 200 years of the church, women apparently were extremely influential based on the writings that were coming from the author that I followed from Emory.
But Charles,
Excuse me, go ahead.
go on.
Some of that goes on today because our daughter-in-law is in a church where she can't teach.
Right.
What?
Yeah.
Would not be allowed to teach an adult class. She can teach children, but she can't teach an adult
So
class.
that's
Absolutely.
It's Church of Christ. and
Yeah,
they're-
so this-
very-
it's based on how much strongly they
They
follow
mind church
the
of
Old
Christ.
Testament.
And she's a CPA and her husband is a stay-at-home dad.
Yeah,
And they would not allow her on the
But-
finance.
Well, there are some.
I don't know why they
Baptist
go to
churches
that church.
that allow deacons, women to be deacons, and some Baptist churches will not allow women to be deacons.
and I encountered this as I was growing up too, because I'm married to the person because of what she was compared to some of what the others that I met. I realized, and they were all wonderful young ladies, but some of them were in the patriarchal and traditional mode. Jean was not in that particular mode, and they would wait. They would, and that was what was interesting. But they would wait for me to do everything. I mean, and I was thinking, I want my partnership to be a partnership, not someone that they wait for me to make every decision. And I was beginning to perceive that in at least one relationship. And now in retrospect, I realized one that did not work out because they realized that I was expecting more of a partnership too than what they were going to give, and they were more traditional. So I encountered lots of those kinds of young ladies. Yes.
Charles, I think it shows you, like in history, in spite of all this, women are probably stronger than men because they didn't let this keep them down. If you look at our society today, the widows probably give more and support more and put more effort in than couples. So, I mean, you've got strong people in the church, in the community, and in everything that they, in spite of all this, it did not keep them from being a part of society and community and being the most important part of it, if you look at it.
I want to go back to your initial scripture. I said I had my own view of that. You obviously didn't grow up a Baptist. If you did, you would know that Stephen was the first deacon. And that 7 men were the first board of deacons. And they were charged to run the business affairs of the organization,
Right.
where the apostles then did the preaching and that sort of thing. They didn't want to be bothered with the day-to-day management. So that's those 7 people were the first board of deacons.
Right. There was one group, chief apostles would read and study and preach the word. But things had gotten so out of hand as far as issues that they wanted to take care of the people in their group, and they needed to have someone else to do it. The other interesting point is that those 7 very wise. They chose the 7 that were making, from the group that were making the biggest complaints. So that also helped, that gave them the spirit to take care of the issues that were at hand at that time. And I guess they worked it all out, but there were several directions this lesson went into in relation to that, and Chris just brought this up. And one of those is that we have 2 orders in the Methodist Church, or have had, but it's been rather informal in the churches I've been a member of, and I don't perceive it here, so I will quickly talk about it here, but and maybe bring Chris into it. The author of the student lesson says Methodism has something unique. We have 2 ordained orders, and they do not exactly line up with other denominations. This makes negotiations with other denominations to get full communion. Let's go back to what Chris is saying. Get full communion agreements, which include allowing pastors to serve in both denominations, a little tricky. However, our 2 orders arguably hearken to this moment in the early church. There was a distinct division of labor in church leadership. The Methodist Church has ordained elders and ordained deacons. Both orders are called to word and service. Now, I'm fully aware of the elders, but I don't think I've been in a church that really had, maybe you had in your history, deacons.
I'm not.
And maybe, are you aware of it when you go to conference?
It is not listed. You don't really see that differential. But it's mainly the elders are your preachers.
And I'm fully aware of elders.
Yeah, and that's about all you ever hear about.
But apparently, maybe in larger churches across the country, that there must.
What are they supposed to do? What's their,
Okay, we'll get into that in just a minute, just a second. The Methodist Church has ordained elders and ordained deacons. Both orders are called to word and service, which means both can proclaim and teach the good news, and both can serve church and community. The difference comes in the other 2 traits of the elders. Elders, typically the pastors of churches, are called the sacrament order and are authorized to administer the sacraments in any context at any time. Elders are called to order the church, which means paying attention to the administration and health of the local congregation, and also committing to nurturing the denomination and the church universal. While elders care for the health of the congregation by growing it through interaction with the world, they tend to be understood as anchored in the church and then moving out into the world. However, deacons might be best understood as serving in the world and bringing the world to the church. I don't know how this, and what we did this kind of thing in my church was we had committees for this activity, and we took care of that way. We had usually someone interested in it to run it. Deacons are ordained to compassion and justice. Again, that does not mean that elders don't engage in compassion and justice, but that the deacons focus particularly on things. And I wondered with Gene at Harmony Grove in Milburn, Georgia, that we had a large number of educational classes, and at one time had been rather expensive, but as this church diminished, well, a group came to us and 2 other churches in there regarding the homeless. And what we did was, for several years just before we left, was we took some of those old classrooms, and for a week, we took weeks that was spread among the churches, and they had social programs, and our church took on that group of homeless. And they would bring their whole families over there, and they would stay with our group for a week. That'd be in a safe situation. And during the day, they would have a representative from the county church or from the county itself who would come in and try to help them find ways to get employment. So that was an activity that was spread among the Methodist Church, Methodist program in Gwinnett County, Georgia at the time, to take care of the homeless. But that was a program, and whoever was heading it would be acting in that role, whether they were Methodist or not. I would think so. That'd be the kind of role that a Methodist would be to organize. That was in the deacon role, would be to organize things that would help public and people within the church community at large, or in the community itself.
Don't you think now we have other agencies that do a lot of that, as opposed to it being so much done by churches?
Yes, but these were sort of falling through the cracks, and we fed them and we took care of them during the whole time we were there, and we got our church congregation up to meet them, and share our word and share our concerns with them and interact with them. What you learned was many of them were just basically like you and me, except that they just had a bad period that got them into real trouble.
We had a lady that worked with Chris in Concord, and she and her husband would go to like the homeless shelter and spend the night and be there counseling and doing things with the people.
And
I
we would
don't
have,
know whether they do that here or not, but if churches do. I know we go down and feed people at the community table, but I don't know whether. people
Somebody
here
has to stay
go and
there. if
spend the
they-
night.
Yeah,
Do they?
somebody does, I think.
Interestingly enough, I asked about this program the last time we visited down there. And somebody donated a building ultimately so that they could be housed instead of having to go from church to church. Because what that meant was they stayed with one church a week, and then if they were still there, they had to pack up everything and be transported to the next church. So it was not ideal, but they're no longer using the churches that way now. Because
I think around here they use 30 days.
so again,
You're allowed to stay in a place for 30 days. And that's why they're moving from one community to another. Because most communities have a 30-day limit. Now, you know, Connie took care of them.
Johnny's doing, yes.
It still does.
Yes.
Large measure at the ordinance. When they're not, they have to leave the shelter by 7 a.m. And they're sitting up there waiting for Connie to open every morning.
You had something with us.
Yeah, if you look at the organizations we've got for this kind of stuff, addiction, wife abuse, child abuse, all that kind of stuff. If you look at them, most of our Christian organizations, kind of voluntary and donation, they're a heck of a lot better than our government organizations because they kind of have that caring. A lot of them do. In patients I had that were alcoholics and they'd go to the state thing, they'd send them to Broughton or whatever, were not very good, but they'd go to a Christian thing. And it seemed to be a lot more successful than the governmental kind of deal.
Sometimes the governmental ones have to take up the really worst ones, and at least in our case, ours were just people have just got temporarily in trouble. We're just trying to help them get past that situation. We were aware of the success stories too. So
Oh,
The government tends to give money. The church gives up.
we'll get right.
That's the difference.
And on that note, I think it is of a concern that we don't have a deacon, so to speak. We do have chairpersons of different communities,
That's the way it's
because-
always been.
because I think that the preachers try to do so much. And I think that's one reason so many Methodist preachers, and I'm not speaking of anyone in particular, get so burned out. You know, right now, we don't have enough Methodist preachers. They've had to call a lot out of retirement, and there are a lot of churches that they're having to serve 2 different churches. And I think maybe it's because they don't have that appointed person to help with those things, because we know there's a need, and the pastor tries to do more than is humanly possible. And I don't mean just this church, you know.
something called a diaconal ministry. I don't know if that was unique to Georgia. But they weren't ordained exactly, but they were trained to be in that role. And they changed the title at some point. And I don't know what.
Maybe they were ordained in the same manner that
What about the Stephen ministry? Is that-
Christ. Another one, that's
Something,
another.
yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
In closing this, talk about deacons still. A deacon's primary appointment tends to be in a secular role. Deacons serve as insurance agents, providing health and life insurance in an ethical manner, but also extending coverage to the poor and the marginalized. Deacons run nonprofits that address childhood illiteracy, aid counseling centers, and teach elementary or high school. Deacons work with the homeless on the streets and with addicts in recovery. They do have a secondary appointment too, a local congregation, which is how they keep their mission in conversation with the church. So, the way that this author describes it. So I'm not familiar with the deacon in my experience with the 2 churches and 2 Methodist churches that we've been associated with. So But maybe in some churches, and maybe it might be a larger church, that's maybe what they can have, that they ordain deacons as well as elders.
Was the deacon's role a paid position? I mean, here, when you were chairman of a group, whatever that responsibility is, you're usually working, doing something else.
It sounds like that these people are working something, they have a paying job somewhere else too.
Okay.
That's what it implies to me. So not knowing, teacher's lesson had a question, and I don't know how we can answer it since we don't have deacons, but it had the question, why do you think it is important to distinguish between the work of deacons and elders in the Methodist Church? So for us, it's kind of irrelevant because we have not encountered the deacons, or I have not.
Well, the deacons in the Baptist church, for example, here, they've called and checked on, they're assigned people. And during this pandemic, they called and checked on these people. And they were, I mean, it wasn't just once a week and that's it. But they checked at least once a week on their people, make sure they were all right.
I noticed that I work around most Baptists.
Yeah.
And Canton Baptist and some of the other local churches. And it is a very important event when they elect deacons.
Mhm.
Very important. I mean, we have a church council that theoretically is sort of the administrative management type group for the business affairs of the church. But boy, when they elect the deacon, it is a big deal. They talk about it and who's going to get it, that sort of thing. And apparently they play a much bigger role than our council does in this church.
They do.
And I have a couple of high school classmates, or several of them have become deacons in Baptist churches. And I follow on Facebook and see that they are bragging about it. They were saying, I don't know what bragging is the right word, but indicating they are pleased to have become that. So
This is not, it's sort of off the subject, but I can remember the time when I was growing up in this church and took communion. I think only the ministers administered communion, or maybe
Mhm.
it was, I don't know, some distinction. Now it's like anybody can be up there holding trays. I don't know that they say the words that like the minister does, but that was a big change to me when other people could get up and help serving communion.
and
And we used to always go to the altar for communion in the church where I grew up.
I hope people are will educate themselves on the split coming in our church. There's a major split coming. And they've already adopted names for the two sides of the church. And one is just going to be Methodist, and the other's going to have a name, progressive name like Liberal Methodism, that sort of thing. And the only thing keeping it from happening is it hadn't been voted on by the General Conference. But and it's supposed to be voted on in 20. They postponed it because of COVID, and now it's scheduled for 2022. And that vote will allow a total split administratively in every way with the United Methodist Church. You got to remember, we're a little bit like the Baptists. We are the United Methodist Church, which is only one branch of Methodism. There are a whole lot of Methodists in this world who are not members of the United Methodist Church. But we're speaking only for the United Methodist Church. But that split is coming.
Okay. The other point he often brought up was what's happened during this past year and a half regarding the pandemic. And the question that she was asking was, finally related to all this. Well, okay, we've had COVID, and our church has had to make adaptations too. And I don't know all the people that were involved, but I am certain there were some that were extremely involved to make it possible for this church to be able to communicate one of those cheap ones that I've been just amazed with because of his dependability has been Mark Sample. Also, I'm aware that in the early days, being able to get this out, Tim Hedrick was involved in trying to get our church services established online, and they had a lot of pains in getting that to happen. And so those are a couple of people that maybe many of us are not aware of in the background that made things really happen.
Yeah, they used to take
They still do.
to people, which is very-
Oh, they still record it, so.
but then now they record it. You can
Right.
view it
But
without them taking.
And I wish Jill were here for this question. Maybe she could help us. Is the work of your church effectively spread among clergy and laity? How can volunteers help so that the pastors have more time to devote to tasks that only they can do? So that's the point that needs to be left here because times.
You did the Bible study, so.
I think the church would fall apart without those people like you.
I agree with you. I agree.
And those are some of the administrative council.
I'm there.
Well, I do think there are still issues. I mean, like you said about the Baptist calling the different members, I think everyone just kind of thinks that's Jill's responsibility. And there's no way she can call all of our church members during the pandemic and check on them. For example, I'm not, and I shouldn't use Jill because that's not really the example I mean, but that's, I mean, that's not really the laity taking the community to the church, like you said. I'm not saying that we necessarily need deacons, but I think sometimes we expect a lot. I mean, Jill is there every day for Book Buddies to help. She was there every night for Bible school. She was there, I think it's a lot for one person to carry. And like you said, does it allow her the time she needs to devote to the task that only she can do?
Yeah.
And I don't mean just this church. I think that's an issue,
Well, she has to interact with other churches too.
Absolutely.
And with the conference and all these things that she has to be involved with.
but I don't feel qualified to do the things that Deacon would do.
And finally, I think the final point of this is, I think it's to make us think, along what we were just saying, do you personally feel more strongly called to care for those within your church or reach new people to grow your church? How are you living into that call? We did have a Stevens ministry here, and I don't know how active it is anymore, anything like that. A couple of people that were involved in it, but so I don't know whether that's still going. Gina and I did receive a call from Jill to do the pandemic, so she was, and I was wondering at the time, did she call everybody? And I was thinking, wow, she did. She had a busy time. So I think now we'll close unless there's something else someone wants to bring up.
Let me say right now living in Washington County, Plymouth. We have a lady minister at our Methodist church there. And then we have 3 in our country that they meet at one church this Sunday, one next, and they rotate.
Right.
And they go around. And the men there were very few men and more women, but the men love this preacher. And we've got this one preacher, the first thing you go to is his column in the weekly paper. And hers has even more women and men reading it and liking her and going to funerals and being so blessed and it being so foreign for you at my age or older, that a woman is preaching to them.
Is this a Methodist church too?
That's Methodist church. And it's changing.
When we left Harmony Grove, we had a female minister that at the time was really well liked, but people say that's one of the things about Methodism. eventually people want something else, so that she's no longer a part of that church.
Or in the Christian church, which my husband was a preacher. And Beth Moore did a lot for men sitting under her on a thing of the Holy Land that she went through. And they were amazed how much they got out of it and enjoyed it. So even the men are growing that way.
I don't know if you noticed it or not, but the concept of the 4-year ministry term has been wiped out of the Methodist Church. So that no longer is part of our motives.
I didn't know it was official.
It is officially out. They call it, they call it the itinerant ministry. The word itinerant has been removed.
Thank you, Chris. Have knowledge that I don't have, appreciate your adding to it. I'm going to go ahead and close with prayer. Lord, may we have the strength to live more fully as a church, caring for our own and reaching new ones in your name. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I stood up too fast, didn't I?
You're most welcome. I saw the frown on your face and I started integrating with women. I tell you. Then I started, maybe she doesn't think that's a joke.